Morning.
Good morning.
One of the effects of getting older I've come to recognize is that more and more things which I remember as having been in the news and seemed like just yesterday happened more than 50 years ago. So the beginning of this sermon is one of those. Because in January of 1964, now over 50 years ago, in his first State of the Union address after assuming the presidency in the wake of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, President Lyndon Johnson declared unconditional war on poverty in America. The question of how to address the problems of poverty has been a subject of discussion throughout our history and had been brought into stark relief during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The issue was sharpened, for this generation at least, with the publication in 1962 of Michael Harrington's comprehensive and influential study of poverty, The Other America. Anybody remember reading that in college or whatever? I certainly do. Johnson, being a New Dealer, was a believer in the efficacy of the federal government to make a significant impact for good. And so he secured passage of the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, part of the so-called Great Society programs, which created the Office of Economic Opportunity, which assisted in the management of federal poverty-fighting grants at the local level. A number of programs that had their origins in the war on poverty continue to this day, including Head Start, Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, now part of the AmeriCorps program, the Job Corps, the Legal Services Program, and many others. And these programs were followed in short order by the Food Stamp Program, which was enacted in 1964, Medicare and Medicaid, which became law in 1965. That's all 50 years ago now. Almost as long as it was, actually longer than it was between those programs and the programs that were enacted in the Great Depression as part of the New Deal. Unfortunately, of course, a number of these initiatives, along with many others, became victims of the Vietnam War and its insatiable appetite for tax dollars and the attention of our leaders, the famous guns versus butter debate. In those days, politicians had the quaint notion that we should actually pay for the wars we fight. While these programs remain on the books, they were often not fully funded, and their legacy remains a matter of controversy to this day. Fighting and defeating poverty, the metaphors that Johnson chose to use, is not an easy thing. For recorded history, the gap between the rich and the poor has been an ongoing challenge, as has been the response of faith communities. The book of Deuteronomy in the Hebrew Scriptures contains this admonition: "You shall generously give to him, your poor and needy neighbor, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land." That's Deuteronomy 15, 10, and 11. It's funny how you never see this passage cited on bumper stickers or signs at football games. But as the Reverend Jim Wallace points out in his book, God's Politics, if you took out all of the passages from the Bible relating to justice for the poor, you would end up with a pretty tattered book. In the Sermon on the Plain, one version of what we now call the Beatitudes, and this is in the book of Luke, Jesus taught, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." And Christians are commanded to care for the least of these. In some parts of Christianity, this has presented itself as what we call liberation theology, with its so-called preferential option for the poor, arguing that the main meaning of the Christian life was to focus on the needs of the poor and the oppressed. Concern for the poor and others in distress is central to other religious traditions as well. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is the practice of zakat, which is a mandatory annual gift of a certain percentage of one's wealth, not just your income, but your wealth, to aid the poor. The Quran reminds believers, on the day of judgment, God Most High will say, son of Adam, I was sick and you did not visit me. And he will reply, my Lord, how could I visit thee when thou art the Lord of the universe? And he will say, did you not know that my servant so-and-so was ill, and yet you did not visit him? Did you not know that if you had visited him, you would have found me with him? Of course, our Unitarian Universalist liberal religious heritage also reminds us of the moral obligation to look out for the poor. They are among those whose inherent worth and dignity we are to respect, and they are an important part of the interdependent web. Now, in most circles, this is not a particularly controversial notion. Except for some extreme libertarians or followers of Ayn Rand, the notion that we should look out for those who are less fortunate is not particularly controversial. The bigger question is posed in the parable that we just heard. What is the most effective way to address these issues? The folks living in the village by the river face the classic dilemma of many who want to deal with issues of poverty, disaster, and oppression. Do we deal with the immediate crisis, or do we try to address the root causes? Now, sometimes the answer is pretty clear. In the face of a natural disaster like the earthquake in Haiti, Hurricane Katrina, or the tsunami of a few years ago, we really have no choice but to immediately respond to the crisis. People need to be clothed and fed and cared for. They can't wait for analysis and long-term solutions. Like the babies floating down the river, they're right here, right now, and they command our attention. Yet at some point, one of the villagers asked, why were all of these babies in the river in the first place? Could we stop the problem somewhere up the river so that we do not need to save the babies when they presented themselves at the village? However, by this time, the machinery for saving the babies was in place and working quite well, and the villagers were comfortable continuing what they had been doing. There are other problems that present this same concern. For example, one of my retirement volunteer activities in Madison has been some work I've done at a local food bank. It's on the north side of Madison, but it's actually the busiest food bank in Dane County. And even as the economy has begun to improve, the needs for its services have continued to expand. And the community has responded to those needs with generous donations of food and money, as well as numerous volunteers helping the pantry in its efforts. But the question arises, is this really a solution to the problem of hunger? Now, it turns out that while unemployment is a factor in the need for services, in fact, of the persons who are using the food pantry, who are not receiving government benefits like disability, Social Security, veterans benefits, the greater percentage of the folks being served are employed rather than unemployed. One of the food pantry directors concluded in an article he wrote in the newsletter that the reason is, he thinks, because people aren't earning a living wage. And it's going to be a long time, he says, before the dream of no one going to bed hungry will be realized. Now, in a bit, I'll come back to this story and tell you about one innovative solution that this organization is pursuing. But first, over time, the churches have confronted the question of how to address issues of poverty and hunger and homelessness and all the other crises of the human condition that we face. Within Christianity, the tradition from which our Unitarian Universalist movement has originated, there's been an ongoing tension between the individualistic view of salvation on the one hand, addressing the question of where will I spend eternity, and the so-called social question on the other hand, what do I do to make a better world here and now? Among the early biblical authors, for example, there is the contrast between Paul's notion of justification by faith, subscribed to by Martin Luther, and the Epistle of James. Faith without works is dead. Now Luther, if he could have, would have read James out of the New Testament canon and felt that the only gospel really worthy of our consideration is the Gospel of John, which shows more the cosmic Christ than the prophet Jesus. And John really doesn't have many of the parables that we're familiar with and the sayings about caring for the poor. And since for Protestants, at least, Luther's views carried the day, the importance of good works has, at times, gotten short shrift. Both Unitarianism and Universalism have always had stronger social justice components to their theology and praxis. William Ellery Channing, a major voice of early American Unitarianism, advocated a strong social justice focus. In addition to his preaching and work in his Boston congregation, Channing was a strong supporter of a fellow by the name of Joseph Tuckerman, who served as an outreach minister for something called the Association of the Federal Street Society for Benevolent Purposes. Federal Street Society was Channing's church. This was actually what we would now call a community ministry. And what Tucker did for his career was to serve the poor and the needy throughout the Boston area, not only members of the church, but people that were in the community and suffering. Now, according to Reverend Gilbert's, who writes about Tuckerman, Tuckerman's approach was to work with poor individuals to address their individual circumstances rather than to push for systemic changes. While the more radical Channing would have preferred more systemic solutions that would address the root causes. Reverend Theodore Parker, another early Unitarian minister in the Boston area, was also a strong proponent of direct action to fight injustice. He was active in the anti-slavery movement. I've mentioned before that he kept a gun on his desk to protect the fugitive slaves that may have come through his church. He also was part of a group of 6 people that advised and supported John Brown in his efforts to foment a slave revolt in the South. But Parker believed in a direct approach to meeting the matters of justice. He is the one to whom is attributed the phrase, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." That was Theodore Parker. I also learned, by the way, in researching this, that one of Parker's confidants was a fellow by the name of William Herndon. Herndon was Abraham Lincoln's law partner in Springfield, Illinois, which is why we see some of the comments that Parker makes finding its way into Lincoln's speeches later. Another 19th century Unitarian, Dorothea Dix, was a friend and collaborator of Channing. Beginning as a teacher, she became involved in working in prisons and mental institutions. And based on her experience of the conditions of these institutions, she embarked on a nationwide campaign to advocate for reform of the penal and mental health systems that she continued till her death. While she ministered to individuals in these institutions, she also spoke out for reform of the underlying systems which she saw causing so much misery. The social gospel was a movement in the late 1800s which promoted the notion that Christianity, including Unitarian and Universalist varieties, should focus on what they called the social question. That is, the impact of the modern industrial society on the lives of ordinary women and men. Arising during the Gilded Age, there was a focus on the unequal distribution of wealth, much like the issues raised today by the Occupy movement and their reference to the 1% versus the 99%. Things haven't changed much. While the early attempts of the churches to respond to the ravages of the industrial era involved mainly charity and direct assistance to alleviate poverty and its consequences, the social gospel movement and its modern equivalents began to shift the emphasis to promoting justice and to addressing some of the underlying issues. In more recent times, Catholics and non-Catholics alike have been taken by Pope Francis' emphasis on the needs of the poor. While charity is important, the Pope, in a letter entitled Charity and Truth, states, charity goes beyond justice, because to love is to give, to offer what is mine to the other. But it never lacks justice, which prompts us to give the other what is his, what is due to that person simply by reason of his being. I cannot give what is mine to the other without first giving what pertains to him in justice. And this provision, this passage was quoted by Sister Simone Campbell as she testified before the House Budget Committee, of which our own Congressman Paul Ryan is a part. So this is really the nub of the problem, isn't it? Where does justice end and charity begin? Let's take the argument about the minimum wage, for example. Let's assume, for sake of argument, that an increase in the minimum wage could either cause a price increase to the customer or a reduction in profits to the business owner or the shares or the heirs of the original owner. But let us further assume that the increase in the minimum wage would mean that the employee would make a living wage so that he or she would not have to rely on charity and the food pantry to survive. Is it enough to give food or money to the food pantry, or should we, individually or as part of a religious institution, take the next step and join the fight for a living wage so that people can care for themselves? Is charity enough, or is more required for justice? Reverend Gilbert argues that the proper role of the liberal church, which for him reads Unitarian Universalism, is to bring about the beloved community, a phrase that was a favorite of Dr. Martin Luther King. According to Gilbert, one of the characteristics of the beloved community is that it's based on justice, which he equates in part with the recognition of the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Gilbert argues that justice has three components: freedom, equity, and community. Gilbert defines freedom as the capacity of individuals and groups to pursue their interests and goals. Freedom maximizes choices of the individual so long as it does not interfere with another's ability to exercise his or her own choices. Freedom means relationships based on consent and freedom from coercion. Equity conveys the sense of fairness, equal access to the necessary material and spiritual goods of life, so as to provide security to all. Or as Gandhi is reputed to have said, there is enough to meet everyone's need, but not everyone's greed. Gilbert argues that the rapidly increasing unequal distribution of wealth in this country is inherently unjust because it denies basic human needs and rights to the poor, and it corrupts the moral and spiritual life of the rich. The third prong of Gilbert's definition of justice is community. A community is a group where persons treat others as ends, not means to some political or economic social goal. Again, the key to community for Gilbert is relationship. And so the pursuit of justice requires us to look up the river and identify the root causes of the social problems we confront. Our goal should be to maximize freedom for each individual or group with which we interact. It's not enough that we try to alleviate the immediate suffering. We must also alleviate and address the underlying causes of that suffering. We must empower individuals and groups to find solutions that meet their needs and promote the needs of their communities. And we must help them find a solution that is equitable to the community. This means that we must work with oppressed communities rather than imposing our solutions on them. Effective social justice work is collaborative. This year, the Service Planning Committee has identified compassion as an overall theme for the year. What I'm suggesting today is what we might call engaged compassion. It's not enough to see people who are hungry or homeless and feel sorry for them. While that's a better response than blaming them for their own economic predicament, more is required. However, a charitable response, supporting food pantries and homeless shelters, for example, also may not be enough. Rather, engaged compassion involves working with the impacted individuals and communities to find responses that address the underlying causes of hunger and homelessness. These may be both issues of public policy and private engagement. Recent studies have demonstrated that there's hardly any location in the United States where an individual working full-time at the minimum wage can afford to rent an average livable one-bedroom apartment. Public policy responses might include advocacy for a higher minimum wage, one that approaches a living wage standard, or encouraging the construction of more affordable housing in the particular locale. A private engagement response might look something like what the food pantry in our neighborhood has done. It's developed a program using a community kitchen to train individuals as pastry chefs and to help them find employment when they successfully complete their training. And during the training, one of the goals is to pay them a living wage, so that in addition to learning specific bakery skills, they also learn valuable life skills to help them get and keep jobs when they graduate. This is a good example of addressing both the immediate needs, providing food to hungry people, while addressing the longer range issues of creating job skills and employment. So how can Open Circle as a religious community address these issues? Well, this morning before the service, Linda Bastian of the Fond du Lac Food Pantry discussed the program called Food for Thought. This was a program that addressed a need of teachers recognizing that children in their schools were often coming in hungry, particularly after the weekend, or they were being very anxious about going home and relating that they weren't sure there would be enough food. And obviously somebody who is hungry cannot perform very well in school, and if they don't perform very well in school, they have trouble developing the skills and needs so that they can continue and break out of the cycle of poverty. And so the response of the food pantry, in addition to its general provision of food, is to make sure that these kids have food to have over the weekends. And over 600 kids so far have been addressed by this program. And so this is a program I would suggest that really does both of these things. It meets the immediate need, but it also looks at what are the underlying causes of the poverty. And very often it's because of people that don't have the adequate educational skills and background to give them a leg up in getting started in life. And so they're addressing both of those. The point is that they are, in fact, looking up the river and looking at what's going on. I'd like to close my remarks this morning with a following story from the Jewish Hasidic tradition, shared by author and activist Eli Wiesel. A disciple made the following remark in front of Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Klotz. God, who is perfect, took 6 days to create a world that is not. The Rebbe scolded him. Could you have done better? Yeah, I think so, stammered the disciple, who no longer really knew what he was saying. You could have done better, the master cried out. Then what are you waiting for? You don't have a minute to waste. Go ahead, start working. Given the troubles in our world today, we don't have a minute to waste either. What are we waiting for? Let's us go ahead and start working.